Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be diving into possibly a new Aeldari meta emerging from the Void itself. And this is actually something that we haven't really seen in this edition so far. In fact, in a vast majority of competitive lists, we have not actually seen this unit appear in them. And that is simply because the unit in question is not very cost effective for what it does, damage-wise that is. However, due to the recent shifts in the competitive meta, I actually think that Corsair Voidreavers are going to be one of the more selected meta picks for Eldar, especially when combined with Wave Serpents. And in this video today, I'm going to explain to you guys why I think that and why I think Voidreavers are going to be an integral part of Eldar meta competitive lists going forward. So first, let's take a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the evolving competitive meta and the possible emergence of Mekhdar as a archetype. We're going to be talking about the problems with Mekhdar and its solution, a look at the list I played this week with some analysis, and lastly, the final thoughts and possible ways to improve the list itself. So first, let's tackle the evolving competitive meta and possible emergence of Mekhdar. So we're seeing more and more lists in competitive play kind of adopt the style of transport spam and mechanized play. We have indeed seen a little bit of this since the beginning of the edition with some factions, but now more and more factions are adopting it. Cheap transports with scout moves have been used in both competitive Imperial Guard and Tau lists that we can see from tournaments like Adepticon. And we've also seen it in other tournaments as well. So it's not just one tournament that we're seeing this in, it's starting to become a pattern. We're definitely seeing this with Tau. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but the last couple of Tau lists that I've seen do really well in competitive play have basically been the same thing, which has been, kind of spamming Devilfishes, spamming Hammerheads and things like that, as well as Skyray missile defense gunships. And as for the Imperial Guard, we are seeing a little bit less of it, but we are still seeing Catachans in Chimeras because obviously that combination is really strong. Being able to scout move a dedicated transport up the field to gain positional advantage is really competitive. And that's simply due to the fact that it gives them a huge positional advantage from the beginning of the game and more room to maneuver in their own deployment zones where they can kind of spread out and affect the battlefield in greater ways. And for those of you out there wondering, scout moves do apply to dedicated transports that the unit is in. So if you have a unit with the scout special rule and they embark in a dedicated transport before the start of the battle, that dedicated transport can make the scout move instead. You do need to end your move more than 9 inches away from all enemy models, which is important to note. You can't just, scout move right on top of enemy units, but this really does give you a lot more maneuverability in the early game, especially on vehicles. So why is the meta evolving towards this, kind of transport vehicle meta, right? Well, I think it has to do with a lot of things. So first of all, transports are really good at blocking up movement lanes. And as we've seen in a lot of competitive events, that's essentially what they're doing. A lot of players are using Devilfishes and Chimeras to block enemy units from getting to certain positions in the battlefield, protecting their own units at the same time as they're also able to provide an expendable tank shock target. Again, tank shock is a very powerful stratagem that deals mortal wounds, and they can secure objectives by both blocking them off, or if they are destroyed on an objective, they can have their passengers just get out and secure it. So it ends up causing a lot of issues for your opponent because not only do they have to kill that Chimera or that Devilfish on the objective, but they also have to kill the unit that disembarks. And it also means you're not as easily able to actually physically move on to the objective to be able to out-OC your opponent. Especially since a lot of the units that are in those Chimeras and Devilfishes are going to have OC2. They're going to be basically dealing with 20 OC on the objective. Now, that's really powerful, right? And there's a lot of armies that simply can't deal with it because although those armies are equipped to deal with tanks and monsters, they're not necessarily as equipped to deal with infantry. And as a result, might not have enough firepower to kill all 10 infantry models on that objective, especially if they go to ground or something like that. So bringing this back to the Eldar, although we don't have the cheapest transports or the most expendable transports, they are fast and do come packing a bit of extra durability and damage. So the real question is, can we make this work with the Craftworld Eldar in a similar way that it works for the Tau and the Imperial Guard? So just to address the elephant in the room real quick, there are problems with Mekhdar that do exist, and they're kind of the reason why Mekhdar hasn't seen a huge resurgence in the Eldar meta. And I think the first and probably biggest issue with it is that Eldar transports have a large footprint, and that makes them harder to maneuver in our deployment zone on turn 1. Now, the reason why the Tau kind of get the pass on this, their vehicles are slower than ours. They have about the same footprint as our vehicles. But the Devilfish is notoriously cheap right now. Basically, the Tau have had a series of point reductions over the last 2 balanced data slates, which have pushed them to the level of a Horde army. And despite the Devilfish having the fly keyword, which to other factions like Dark Eldar and Eldar has been an expensive tax to have on our vehicles, the Devilfish basically gets away for it for free. Of course, that may change with the Codex, and, if I'm being completely honest with you guys out there that are listening to this, and maybe some of you who play Tau who are expecting huge point decreases to match the current index, I think you guys will be a little bit disappointed. Because believe it or not, I think when those points become official, you're going to find that not a lot has changed. I don't think GW is going to give you guys a new codex and also reduce the points costs of all the units back to their index point levels. Which I kind of think is more than fair, because your codex does have a lot of cool new tricks and tools and toys in it that are going to make you guys really strong, even at the current point cost listed in the codex. Now, aside from the Tau, who can kind of just currently throw their vehicles away because they're so cheap and so plentiful, other armies do have a similar issue in that they have a large footprint, but they have access to scouting transports to solve this. So if you wondered why it's okay for Imperial Guard to run a lot of Chimeras, it's because, quite frankly, they have Scout, right? If you put 10 Catachans in there, they get the Scout keyword. Or ability, I should say, and that gives them the option of being able to, kind of forward deploy onto the battlefield, engage enemy units right away, and also give a little bit more breathing room to the units in their deployment zone. Now, if only Eldar had some kind of way to give Scout to their dedicated transports, because I think that would solve a big issue that both the Tau and the Imperial Guard don't really have to worry about so much. Because again, their transports are really cheap and they have access to scouting transports, which give them a little bit more breathing room. So what is the Eldar solution to this problem, right? This barrier of being able to run Mekhdar efficiently. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in come the Corsairs. Both the Corsair Voidreavers and Void Scarred have Scout 7, which can be applied to the transports they deploy in, namely the Wave Serpent. Now, between the Voidreavers and the Void Scarred, I think you got to go with Voidreavers because A, they're cheaper, and everybody knows that you need cheaper units to act as trading pieces early on in the game, which the Wave Serpents and, of course, the Reavers are there for. But also because I just think they're better. And the reason why is because if you take them in units of 5, the Reavers get the option of taking a blaster. And if you look at the Corsair Void Scarred, they essentially get the same thing, and all of their options are locked behind taking a 10-man unit. So unless you want to take a big unit of Corsair Void Scarred, you kind of have the same thing going on, but an arguably worse ability. Lethal hits is something that you can get off of Shroud Runners, and I would much rather have the whole unit re-rolling their hit rolls against enemy units than simply getting lethal hits in the first place. Precision is nice and everything, but it's probably not worth it on a 5-man unit with no options. Now, getting the Voidreavers into the Wave Serpents will allow you to maneuver and get better positioning early due to that Scout 7, which by the way is an additional inch over the Imperial Guard Chimera Catachan combo because the Catachans only have Scout 6. Once again, proving that the Eldar are superior not only in their technology, but also the size of their scout move. And let's be honest, guys, the ladies will tell you every inch matters, and the Eldar, of course, are bigger. But of course, all jokes aside, because the list I brought this week was bringing the heat in more ways than one, and let's go ahead and take a look at what I came up with and what I think is going to be what we might start seeing in competitive play going forward. So this game was in fact a 2,000 point Strike Force game. The list ended up coming out to 1985, which is a little bit low, but there was nothing else I could have put in. So, I would have rather kept it at this point than actually switched a couple things around to get to that even 2,000. And taking a look at the characters, we have the Autarch Wayleaper leading the pack with the Phoenix Gem, of course, with all the fixins. It has the Dragon Fusion Gun, Howling Banshee Mask, and Starglaive. Personally, I preferred the Howling Banshee Mask, but, the Manda Blasters, especially in a list like this, might actually be worth considering. Being that it is a more aggressive style list, we have the Death Jester, of course, with Fate's Messenger. And I love using the Death Jester in mechanized lists, just coming out of a Falcon, being able to get those sustained hits, rerolls to wound on devastating wounds can absolutely slap. And of course, it's also a lone op, just like the Autarch Wayleaper, which gives opponents a lot of issues. If they do have 3-inch deep striking stuff, that can pose a problem. But because of the Death Jester's little small base, oftentimes Phantasm will be enough to move it back out of line of sight. Fuegan is also in this list, so Fuegan is obviously one of the more powerful Phoenix Lords, bar none, the best Phoenix Lord, because of the Phoenix Gem style ability that he has. And of course, we all love Fuegan. We know why he's good. He has a great anti-large attack that can basically one-shot a tank. He also has a beam profile that's pretty good at murdering mech infantry like Space Marines. And of course, in combat, he's great at killing 3-wound models. That strength 5, AP -4, and damage 3 weapon cleaves right through most armor. But really, these characters are good, but their inclusion in this list is very particular. I included them in there because they have, for the most part, the ability to evade enemy attacks in one way or another, or in sometimes multiple different ways, like the Autarch Wayleaper. All 3 of these models are going to be used fairly aggressively on mid objectives to try to hold objectives, while my Wave Serpents and other units kind of tie and focus down my opponent's main threats. And one notable thing you will notice about this particular list is it doesn't technically have a strong bully type unit that can kind of bully the midfield and capture objectives for you. It doesn't have the Avatar of Cain. It doesn't have a big unit of Wraith Blades or Wraith Guard or anything like that. It doesn't even have a small unit of Wraith Guard. So I did need a couple of units in here that were, kind of sneaky durable, that had the ability to resurrect and had lone op. As far as my battle line units go, I actually have 3 of these units of Corsair Voidreavers, and I armed them with the close combat weapons, or I should say the power swords and the shuriken pistols. I have 1 blaster in there as well. The idea behind these units is they're going to be trading early, engaging enemies, blocking up charge lanes, and just making a mess of things. They also have pretty good quality attacks when fighting units on objectives with full rerolls to hit. And also being able to take a single blaster in the unit, while it doesn't seem like a big deal, can actually do some good things. You can pop a lone operative with it if you're lucky enough, if your opponent deploys in a position where a scout move, a disembark, and an advance would throw them off. Then you could actually be in luck. You could actually pop that lone operative. I've had games before where they've actually been able to do this, and it's not expected. Your opponent thinks that, kind of lone op is going to protect them and keep them safe. But when talking about a fast-moving unit like this, sometimes it's just not the case. However, I'd be lying to you guys if I said that this unit was good on its own. It's actually not the greatest on its own. It actually doesn't trade effectively or as effectively as other units in your army. So, why do I have this unit in here? Well, it's for the 7-inch scout move that it confers the Wave Serpents, which I do have 3 of in this list. Now, these Wave Serpents are all carrying twin Bright Lances. You could swap them for Shuriken Cannons. In this list, though, I really wanted to make sure that my anti-large was at peak efficiency, because I didn't know if I was going to be going up against other mechanized lists or, lists with a lot of tough and heavy targets, and I just wanted to make sure that whatever I was shooting at was dead. So I didn't mess around with the Shuriken Cannons like I sometimes do in my other lists, went straight for the Bright Lances so that I would have the maximum amount of anti-large as possible. Now, the thing about Wave Serpents is they're actually pretty good. A lot of people discount them, or they say they're kind of only good for, carrying units of 10 when you can't afford, 2 Falcons for the same cost. Of course, Falcons are more expensive. So, if you want to carry 2 dragons, but, you don't have the points for 2 Falcons, you go with the Wave Serpent. Well, I actually think that the Wave Serpent is a lot better than people give it credit for. And I did a recent video covering the Wave Serpent, but in this particular list with Corsairs, it can surprisingly deal a ton of mortal wounds damage alongside the Corsairs, and you can actually kill something extremely valuable with mortal wounds alone if you get the first turn and if your opponent doesn't expect it. So basically what you do is you use your scout move to propel your Wave Serpent forward 7 inches in the beginning of the game. You move forward another 14 inches, putting you 21 inches. Now this puts you well within range of both your Serpent Shield and of course the, kind of potential charge that the Wave Serpent can do later that turn. The Corsairs themselves are also going to jump out 3 inches from the Wave Serpent. They're going to be well within range to use their grenades ability. And yes, Corsairs do have grenades, so they can use the grenade stratagem, which on average will give you about 3 mortal wounds. Then you're going to go ahead and shoot with them and stuff like that. And then you're also going to use the Wave Serpent's ability, which is the Serpent Shield. That'll give you another, on average, 2 mortal wounds dealt to the unit. So now we're at 5 mortal wounds, guys. Then, to seal the deal, we're going to charge the Wave Serpent in. And it doesn't matter how tough that opponent is. It doesn't matter how tough they are. They're going to be just taking mortal wounds. So you charge the Wave Serpent in, and if the strength of the unit is less than 5, so basically 5 or less, you're getting an additional 2 dice. So you get to roll 8 dice, and for each 5+ you roll, you get another mortal wound, which should average to about 3. So in total, you're already doing about 8 mortal wounds worth of damage, also forcing a battle shock, and of course also you get to shoot the blaster and the twin-linked bright lance and shuriken cannon of the Wave Serpent. Now, of course, you could whiff and you could do nothing. I mean, rolling 4-ups and 5-ups is a little bit swingy, but the potential is there to do a lot of damage. And we're talking about a Wave Serpent and a unit of Corsairs here. So, even if they die, even if they don't trade up, they're doing a lot of damage in the first couple of turns of the game, and they're also blocking off your opponents from being able to move throughout the battlefield. And that's the other thing that we're going to be doing with these Wave Serpents. These Wave Serpents are meant for pure disruption. They're meant to basically go out there, do a bunch of damage, and then die. Basically tie up enemy units, so that they can't move around properly while the rest of our army scores on objectives and things like that. And not only does this prevent your opponent from getting objectives, but it also protects your units as well, because we have in this list some other aspects to it that are going to be, kind of waiting in the wings, ready to pounce forward. And of course, bringing up the rear, we have triple Falcons. Falcons are there to essentially respond to anything the enemy throws at us once the Wave Serpents kind of start engaging enemy units, blocking up charge lanes and stuff like that. Corsair Voidreavers are going to die quickly. Their job is to basically just disrupt enemy units and make the best trades they can while scoring early secondaries. Their job isn't to survive. So once they're destroyed, hopefully that will leave enemy units open to counterattack, in which case the Falcons are going to have just an absolute field day, because their cargo, of course, is fire dragons. So if your opponent comes down with incessors, deep striking to clear out enemy units, or, your opponent charges forward with terminators to wipe out a Wave Serpent and a unit of Corsairs, guess what's going to be waiting for them? 3 units of 5 fire dragons. And basically any kind of medium to light vehicle and heavy infantry are going to be slaughtered by these guys. They're really good. They're really efficient, especially out of a Falcon. And of course, remember, we do have Fuegan with them. He's not going to be, of course, attached to a unit of fire dragons, most likely, but is going to be, in one of those Falcons. So he will be able to lend his support to the battle as well. Now, in my opinion, no list would be complete without a couple of units of Shroudrunners. But wait, Proxy Hammer, I thought you said this was a mechanized Eldar list. Doesn't that mean everything has to be in Wave Serpents and Falcons? If I was running a fully themed list, yes, absolutely, the Shroudrunners would be out. But this is more of a theme light list that is geared towards competitive play, so we are going to have some competitive units, and Shroudrunners are going to be one of those units. Now, Shroudrunners are very good for a couple of reasons in this list. A, they kind of fill the gap that the rest of the list doesn't really do well in, which is secondary objectives. We don't want Falcons necessarily, having to perform those every turn. And we definitely don't want fire dragons doing it if we can help it, if they have better targets. So our Shroud Runners are going to be carrying that burden. And now, of course, Shroud Runners can do a lot of different things. I've done a video on these guys before. They're excellent. You can use Fire and Fade from your own deployment zone in the first turn to score things like behind enemy lines and stuff like that, which is extremely good. But they're also a fantastic force multiplier, so if your army is having trouble wounding a big target, you can focus it down with lethal hits. Now, one of the things I considered when making this list is what happens when I go against something that is extremely tough, toughness 13, that my Bright Lances and Pulse Lasers, and Fire Dragons, quite frankly, can't really handle. And my answer to that was if I go up against something like Hyper Crypt Legion that has a Necron Monolith, or Imperial Guard that's going to have a Bane Blade, I'm going to first mark that Monolith or Bane Blade with lethal hits, and then my Fire Dragons, my Bright Lances, my Warwalkers, whatever it is, are just going to absolutely go to town on it. Because, yeah, there might not be that many lethal hits, but it's going to push my damage to that point where I can actually eliminate that target. And the other great thing is that, remember, we have 3 Wave Serpents in this list. So if we kind of strategize around that and we don't, kind of waste our Wave Serpents early on in the game, we could easily put 2 Wave Serpents into the Monolith, into the Bane Blade, and force Battle Shock tests. Yes, it won't always fail, but if it does fail, that's a lot less durability for our opponent who can now no longer use stratagems on it. So say goodbye to popping smoke, say goodbye to, popping that 4+ invul on the Monolith. All of that is gone, and, most likely those units are going to be fried by the end of the turn. And lastly, Shroud Runners do give you a little bit of precision and a little bit of anti-horde, so you can deal with those Nurglings, so you can deal with those, Necron Scarab Swarms, and stuff like that, is not going to be a good target for your more heavy-hitting stuff. And of course, to round out the list, we have Double Warwalker. They're carrying Bright Lances. I just like the Warwalkers in this list because they have Scout. And by the way, guys, if you haven't kind of caught on to it, there's a ton of stuff with Scout in this army. All 3 Wave Serpents have Scout, 2 Shroud Runners have Scout, and of course the Warwalkers have Scout as well. So if you wanted to, you could play some serious mental games with your opponent, redeploying in your own deployment zone, or, perhaps even if you get first turn, taking the offensive early on and getting better positions to stage in a place where your opponent is really going to be vulnerable. And Warwalkers are just kind of like, they're not super durable, but they're durable enough to where if your opponent has to kill a Wave Serpent, a Falcon, Fuegan, a Death Jester, and a Warwalker, chances are your opponent's not going to be able to kill all that because you have -1 to wound on Warwalkers, you have a 5+ invul on Wave Serpents, you can Fate Dice, you have, kind of Resurrection type abilities in this list, you have Lone Op in this list. There's a lot of things that are going to prevent your opponent from being able to table you in one turn. So, this list does look very fragile. It looks like it doesn't have a big avatar or a big, block of Wraith Blades to hold it up. But when it's actually on the battlefield, it's deceptively durable. And, I'm not talking about traditionally durable, being durable as in having a lot of wounds, having a ton of toughness and stuff like that, but deceptively durable in that a lot of the units in this list are simply going to be hard to actually take out, right? Because there's going to be layers to it that are going to prevent your opponent from doing so easily. So, to go back to our Wave Serpents are blocking enemies off so they can't get good line of sight. Our Corsairs are locking up units into combat, potentially. Obviously, Corsairs aren't the greatest combat unit out there, let's be real, but they can definitely trade okay with units like Scouts, different things of that nature. And if you can actually manage to charge them into things like enemy vehicles, those enemy vehicles, regardless of whether or not they can fire in combat, which, all vehicles can because they have the big guns never tire rule, that's still going to be an issue because, again, they're going to have to get line of sight and they're going to have to eventually score on objectives, and you're preventing them from doing both things. And the last point I want to make about Warwalkers, and the reason why I think they fit so well in this list, is because they have a very small footprint, unlike the rest of our army, but they still pack an immense punch. So 2 Bright Lances is a very efficient way to kill vehicles, and combined with their scout move, they can easily get some amazing angles on turn 1 and pop a few of your opponent's key targets in the first turn before they have a chance to react. And oftentimes this will put your opponent into a panic. They'll start blowing CP, right? The only CP they have. They'll use it to pop smoke. They'll use it to, do a command reroll for an armor save. They're going to try all sorts of things to try to keep their stuff alive during turn 1. And that just plays to your advantage. Even if they do reroll it and make that armor save, that's a command point down for your opponent, and you're already putting your opponent into a mental state of panic. This list puts an immense amount of pressure on your opponent from turn 1. And even if you don't get first turn, the ability to just pop back behind obscuring terrain, force your opponent to come forward all the while they're thinking about all the ways in which your units can kill them, is going to be an immensely powerful mind game as well. Alright, so what were my final thoughts on the list, and what were the areas in which I think it can improve? So the list did, believe it or not, perform beyond my wildest expectations. The massive amount of scout in the army really put my opponents on the back foot, and deployment took forever. My opponents were figuring out, okay, what are the threat ranges of all my units? How do I deal with all of this scout? What if my opponent gets the first turn and just has a bunch of stuff on me turn 1? So right out of the gate, this list is already making my opponent sweat. The next thing is that my opponent had no idea where I was going to actually go, right? If I don't get first turn, my whole army can essentially get a redeployment. All 3 Wave Serpents, 2 Warwalkers, and of course, my Shroud Runners can all basically redeploy within their scout move range. So that's the other thing my opponent was thinking of. How do I deal with that? How do I deploy so that my army is essentially not out of position if I don't, in fact, get second turn? And what ended up happening is my opponent deployed very conservatively against this type of list, and it ended up spelling doom for them because it took them out of range of getting on objectives turn 2, especially when you consider my units could just go forward anyway and block off any movement lanes that possibly existed. Because, of course, I didn't need to get out and charge with all my Corsairs. I didn't need to, throw my Wave Serpents into combat to tank shock. Those things are nice, but it's not needed for this list to perform well. After all, the goal of the game is to score on objectives. And if my army potentially can threaten my opponent from turn 1 and they deploy more conservatively as a result, it's a win-win for me because I can just then kind of have more room on the battlefield in which I can move around. The other thing about the list that really struck me is how much hard target elimination it had and how much mortal wound potential it had. There was a point in the game where I moved up a Wave Serpent and, just like I told you guys in my example, I dumped out my Corsairs, I used grenades, I used the Serpent Shield, and I tank shocked an enemy Dreadnought on an objective and killed it just with mortal wounds alone. As a matter of fact, I actually did shoot a Blaster and a Bright Lance at it, and those both whiffed. They did absolutely nothing. The hard target elimination weapons did nothing to the Dreadnought. He Armor of Contempted very cleverly, and, he made his armor save, and then, of course, it was the tank shock that did him in. However, I'm going to be real with you guys. I did roll pretty good on that tank shock. I got 4 out of 6 mortal wounds on it, and the grenades, I also got 4 out of 6 grenades on. And lastly, the Serpent Shield, got 2. So I did deal 10 mortal wounds to it. And on average, I probably should have only dealt about 7 mortal wounds to it, maybe 8 if I'm lucky, right? But, I did end up rolling a little bit hot. I did bring that thing down, and it was amazing to bring something down with mortal wounds alone. So that was really quite crazy. Now, I did notice a couple of things, though. I did notice that, early on in the games, when my opponent would look at my list, they would often just go for the Shroud Runners. They would go for the units that they knew could score secondaries. It's kind of like common knowledge now. It's funny how the internet works, guys, because it's common knowledge now, even in local game stores, that when you're fighting Eldar, you take out their secondary objective scores ASAP. Because if you can limit their ability to score secondary objectives, obviously you can also limit their ability to win the game because they're weak on primaries. So I did think that at times I had a little bit too much anti-large and I was, kind of burning through units too quickly, and some of my units really didn't have great targets to shoot at. And it would have been nice to have a couple of units of Swooping Hawks or Warp Spiders in the list instead of the Warwalkers. And I think when I try a couple of variations of the list, I might actually sub both Warwalkers in for units of Warp Spiders. Now, the reason for this is Warp Spiders are around the same cost. They do a lot less damage against large targets, but they're way better at secondaries. They also have great Overwatch potential, and of course the last thing about them is that they just deal devastating wounds, right? So in a pinch, they can still deal a significant amount of mortal wounds to a large target or, monster, vehicle, whatever, and finish it off. 2 units of Swooping Hawks and a unit of Rangers was also a consideration I was making instead of the Warwalkers because, of course, the Rangers are really good at scout and infiltration denial, and the Swooping Hawks have unparalleled secondary objective scoring and light infantry clearing. And while none of those units have scout, they put pressure on the opponent anyway because of their insane mobility. Warp Spiders being able to move 24 inches and shoot, Swooping Hawks being able to sky leap, and of course they can also just, move and advance and still shoot. And then, Rangers being able to, infiltrate up the board. All of those things still put a high amount of pressure on my opponent, so I think I would get a similar result as what I had with the Scouts. As far as my opponent's initial reactions went. Now, as for the games I played with this list, I did end up playing 3 games in total. I played 1 game against my Ultramarines buddy who, traditionally runs a lot of tactical Marines, Rhinos, kind of, your classic Space Marine army. So, not the most competitive thing out there, but it's always a good baseline to test lists against just to see if the concept itself works. And usually we're just kind of BSing around anyway, so, it wasn't a super competitive game by any stretch of the imagination, but it did give me a chance to test out the list at a baseline level, and it did perform very well. I also played a game against Imperial Guard, and, he wasn't running a Baneblade or anything like that we've been, kind of seeing creep up in competitive Guard play lately, but he was running a fair amount of tanks, and he was running a list with, Lord Solar Leontis, Ursula Creed, and some of the more meta Imperial Guard picks that you do see in competitive play, and the list did quite well against him also. As with the speed of my Wave Serpents, I was really able to kind of box him into a corner early on in the game, and he wasn't able to get his tanks where they wanted to go efficiently so that he could score on objectives. And, by the end of the game, it was a bloodbath. Both of us had huge amounts of models that had been killed in the game, but when it came to objectives, I was able to essentially make sure that he couldn't score a lot of the primary objectives that he wanted to. My third and last game was kind of a curveball. I wasn't expecting to face him, but I ended up facing up against Chaos Knights. It was kind of like a change in plans. I was supposed to go against my Necron buddy, but, instead I went up against Chaos Knights. And fortunately for me, I had plenty of anti-large weaponry to deal with them, and with the amount of screening that my Wave Serpents were able to do to block his War Dogs from being able to, get to my Fire Dragons and stuff like that, it was just basically open season from turn 3 onwards. I am hoping to get more games in with this list, and I will update you guys as I play more with it. It is really fun as well. I mean, I have to say, using Corsairs and using that scout move is super, super fun. The amount of mind games you can pull off this list is truly staggering, and, it really was enjoyable, I have to say. Mekhdar has always had a soft spot in my heart because it's the competitive army I played in 5th edition. But, playing it again in 10th edition, in an edition where it's not necessarily the go-to meta list everywhere, was a little refreshing. So, in conclusion, with mechanized armies on the rise due to their effectiveness on the battlefield, I think Mekhdar have a lot of teeth and certainly have a lot of skin in the game. The sheer amount of movement, hard target elimination, mortal wound damage, and objective play this type of list has is absolutely terrifying. And realistically, a lot of my opponents looked at the list and thought I was kind of running kind of a meme, kind of themed list, but in reality, it's actually really strong. And it really does defy expectations, at least on GW terrain layouts. I haven't tried this on any kind of WTC terrain layouts. I don't know exactly how hard it would be to maneuver Wave Serpents through that type of terrain. But I'm also thinking with the scout move, having Scout 7, that might actually be pretty good, to allow the Wave Serpents to get up the battlefield quickly and be able to get into better positions to fire on targets, and just make it easier to also block enemies from being able to move up the battlefield themselves, because Wave Serpents do have a large hull, which means it's going to be hard to move past them without fly. But yeah, that's basically my experience running this type of list. I found it really refreshing to use a unit that not a lot of people are using in more ways than just a meme or a pure theme. Like, obviously we have the Corsair, kind of themed list, which is awesome. It's maybe not super competitive though. And I think that, using a non-competitive unit in a different way in a competitive setting is kind of cool. But definitely let me know in the comment section what you guys think about this list and, any potential weaknesses it might have and what matchups it might struggle against. I really want to know because I'm going to continue to play this list and really see how good it is and really give it a good stress test to see if it's really worthy of competitive play. Because, I don't know. I felt something really powerful about this list. And, I don't feel this super often. I usually feel like my opponents have a decent chance of winning the game. But in some of these matchups, I really did feel that, no matter what they were bringing, it just wasn't going to be enough to stand up to what this list could offer. Having said that, however, I have yet to go against Necrons. I have yet to face against Custodies with this list. So, within the next couple of weeks, I hope to have those games. And I will, of course, tell you guys about my experiences with it. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters for supporting the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel and join the channel's Patreon, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to check out my channel store page to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store, or you want to check out Amazon through the affiliate link below to get some, discounted Eldar miniatures, I will also leave those links in the description as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.